Hey everyone, I'm going to give things just a second to go through here, give everybody one last moment to check into the live stream here. Today we're going to do our third installment of the Stryd for the Love of Running series. We're super excited for this. We're taking advantage of some of the current situations going on globally, and we're trying to provide more content out there. So my name is Evan. I've been hosting this the past couple days, and we're really excited to keep this thing rolling here. Today, I'm going to be talking about my experience at the U.S. Olympic Marathon Trials. I ran that on February 29th, and I'm excited to kind of show off a little bit of the data. I didn't have the greatest race. I can still talk about my experience there, but I can talk about specifically heading into the trials, how you can plan, execute, and reflect, and then also after a race for anybody or after a situation for anybody, different strategies that you can use to recover, refocus, and regroup. So I'll give things just one more second here to go through, and then I think we should be all good. Okay, cool. So producer Angus, if you can load up my thing here, thank you very much. I appreciate it. I'm going to be talking about planning, executing, and reflecting. So specifically, there are going to be a couple components here that I'll go through. If you have any questions along the way, please drop them in the chat live stream on YouTube. Producer Angus will send them my way. We'll be doing, the last slide will be for all of the questions and answers here. So now that we're situated, we're going to get going. So topics today: the Olympic Marathon Trials, specifically my experience, kind of how I got there, talking a little bit more about my running, and then going to talk about recovering, regrouping, and refocusing. How can you actually use that? Some of my tips for that. Planning, executing, and reflecting, kind of three-part series on how you can tackle any sort of goal. And then lastly, wrapping it up with a question and answer. So what is it like to run at the Olympic trials? I wanted to put together, some cool flashy pictures here, but I thought that just talking about it would be the best kind of way. So me as a runner, I started running in middle school. My dad was a avid marathoner back in the day. He ran Boston. He grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. I'm originally from Ohio. And so I had a love of running at a young age. I remember in 1996 for the Atlanta games, seeing the Olympic the Olympic torch actually go by the top of my street. So that was super cool. I remember we still have Coke bottles from that Olympiad. That was in Atlanta because Coke is based in Atlanta. And just the Olympics were instilled, in the love of running were instilled on me at a very young age. And so I grew up loving running. I started running in middle school for my middle school, ran in high school. In high school, I ran 4 minutes and 34 seconds for the 1600. I ran 9 minutes, 43 seconds for the 3200, which is about 2 miles. And the 5K I ran 15:51 for cross country. And so I wasn't great. I wasn't terrible. But that got me enough of a performance to be recognized and be able to walk on at my local college. It's The Ohio State University. I don't usually say the, but people call it The Ohio State University. And so I got to walk on there. And that means that I wasn't a scholarship athlete, but I was good enough to get a spot on the team. And so my freshman year, I ran cross country there, got hurt like all freshmen do because I wasn't sleeping, I wasn't recovering, I wasn't focusing on running. I was just enjoying my freshman year. In college, I started taking things a lot more seriously, started running a bit more that summer, came back. The coach left after my freshman year. My sophomore year, a new coach came in. I ran 32:12 for the 10K and then got cut from the team. And so I was pretty devastated. I had loved running my whole life. Like I said, grew up running. And I was told that, hey, you're not good enough anymore. You're cut off the team because I couldn't run fast enough. And so that really, put me down for a brief moment. But then I used that experience to kind of shape my transition to the roads and started doing road racing and training myself. So this will be kind of relevant the next slide, basically. So I started running on the roads, started improving my performance by just being really serious and really dedicated. And so That was 2012. I ran my first half marathon in 2014. I ran 69:07 in the half marathon. The next year, I ran my first marathon. I ran 2:31:58 for the marathon. And then 2 years after that, I ran 2:18:19 in the marathon. So there's a ton of hard work there, a ton of focus, a ton of dedication to running. But that 2:18:19 marathon punched my ticket to the 2020 U.S. Olympic Marathon Trials. It was my second marathon. I had done a ton of hard work up to that point, and I didn't really grasp the gravity of the situation. I didn't really realize how important it was until I reflected back on, hey, I'll be going to the Olympic trials, something I had, dreamed about doing as a kid. And my dad told me, hey, someday if you get good enough, you can definitely make the Olympic trials. And so what it's like to run at the Olympic trials, it was probably the coolest experience that I've ever had in my life. Just being there, seeing all of the other runners in the sport, and just being able to relate in the running world with all of the other high-level performers. There was very, very cool. You get in an elevator and all of a sudden you're standing next to somebody that's been at a world championship, somebody that has a world championship medal, somebody that's been to the Olympics, just tons of talent that were kind of loaded in that weekend. So my experience with the Olympic trials wasn't the greatest. I was hurt the 6 weeks going into it. So unfortunately, I had to stop due to injury at mile 21. But I want to talk about, a better situation at the Olympic trials. My fiance is a good runner. She uses Stryd. She had a great buildup, and I want to share her data and her run at the Olympic trials because it provides a little bit more practical application of the things I wanted to talk about today. So specifically after the trials, I can talk about this part for me. So recovering after marathon is in quotes because this is very relevant for the marathon. Immediately, kind of hobble in. Like I said, I dropped out at 21 because my knee hurt very badly. But immediately I said, okay, even if I got the finish, I should focus on recovery. So immediately I changed my shoes. I put warm clothes on. I got water. And I got something in my body. So they had a ton of food that was there at the the tent at the finish line, and so I was able to kind of get fuel in my body, make sure I got a lot of fluids. Immediately, you don't necessarily want to just sit down. This is a very, very popular thing at a marathon finish line. You see people's legs give out underneath them, but immediately. For recovery, the best thing to do is just keep moving, try and refuel and replenish your body as best you can. The next day in Atlanta, we were able to go walk around a little bit in the morning. In the past, I had been somebody that has been able to run the next day after a marathon, and I don't think it's the smartest idea. Sometimes when you're still riding that, high energy that you have from the marathon, it's very easy to just say, okay, you know what, I'm gonna just go out on an easy, 30-minute jog. That was me in the past. Me now said, okay, I'm just gonna walk around as much as I can. So the next day, started running. The advice here that I'm trying to talk about gets a little bit more practical with the next week. So a couple of things you can do the next week. Add in a little bit of body weight motion circuits and add in a little bit of rope stretching. This is going to be something I'll talk about a little bit later in terms of accountability. But the next week, it's okay to start being a little bit more active. The next 2 weeks, you can start doing some cross training. You can start, probably feeling better because it's somewhere between 7 to 14 days of, the time since you beat your legs into submission. And then starting to run again. This is always the big question mark with people after a marathon. Like I mentioned, I've been able to run 8 miles the day after a marathon and feel pretty okay, but then the negative effects of that don't or outweigh any potential positives that you get. So you're not really gaining any fitness running the next day. You're just hindering some of the recovery. So there's a ton of great advice out there. But starting to run again, for me, in my situation, I took 2 weeks completely off. My fiance took 2 weeks completely off as well, and now we're starting to run again. So this race was at the very end of February in Atlanta, and now it's the middle of March, heading towards the end of March. So now it's okay to get that green light to start to run again. So refocus. The 3 big things here are recover, refocus, and regroup. So talking about refocus, after any race, I think it's really, really important, if you can, to actually keep a physical interaction of your thoughts. So whether that's typing on your phone, writing down on paper, entering on a running log, going to the Stryd app and leaving a note in there attached to the race is a totally fine thing to do. But here are some of the points that I want to visit for refocusing, and this is for any race scenario. So the first point here is, what was your focus? So I think it's actually really important to take a step back before the race day and say, okay, what was my focus? What was I actually trying to achieve at this race or this effort? It doesn't necessarily even have to be a race. It could be, if you're doing a time trial, or if you're just in a good block of training. After you finish that, the number one point for refocusing that I have is, what was your focus? So let's say your focus heading into a race was to solely make it through, to just not blow up, not have to stop and walk. It's perfectly okay to go back and just realize what your actual focus was, because this will help for one of the later points here. So the number 2 point, how did you do? So just say, okay, let me look at my performance. How did I actually do? And so that could be, placed. You could have finished top 3 at the Olympic trials and be punching your ticket to the 2020 US Olympic team. It could be, hey, I PR'd. How much did I PR by? How did I actually do? The number 3 point, what can you change? So talking about change from a focus standpoint is realizing that, you have, what was your focus, before the race? How did you do in the present moment? And then what can you change? What can you change going forward? That is a part of focusing. So you have these 3 kind of timelines that you can actually look at, and you can understand how you did, what was your focus before how you did, and then after how you did, how can you actually change for the future? How did you deal with the things you couldn't change? So this is, again, talking about during the present moment. What can you actually do in the present moment to deal with the things that you had no control of? So was it windy? Was it too hot? Did you not get a lot of sleep because the people next to you in your hotel room were up partying until 4 a.m.? That's probably happened to some people traveling out of town for a race. Did you have too much nervous energy? Did you wear shoes that you thought were good, and then all of a sudden during the middle of the race you literally couldn't change your shoes? But how did you deal with that sort of thing that you could not change? This 5th point here is probably my most important, and one of the things that I've found, to be the most helpful in the best for me is, how would you like to imagine for next time? So when I ran my first marathon in 2015, like I said, I ran 2:31:58. I was on 2:25 pace through 18 miles. And then all of a sudden, the marathon caught up with me, and I hit the wall at 18 miles, and I had to trot it in and finish in 2:31. So obviously not the performance I was hoping for, but what would you like to imagine for next time? Every single run after that point, there was some time that I imagined crossing the line in under 2 hours and 19 minutes for my next marathon. Every single run. I'm a huge believer in visualization. And I don't think just because you can imagine something, it's necessarily going to happen. But what would you like to imagine for next time? I think it is so vital to have a positive visualization when it comes to expecting your performance for the next time. If it makes you happy to just reenact the last 100 meters in your mind of your next goal race, I would 100% say go do that. I'm a huge believer in this kind of positive line of thinking. But there was not any run that I did not imagine crossing the line in under 2 hours and 19 minutes. And then when it actually came, I was like, oh yeah, I've done this before. In my head, literally hundreds and thousands of times, I've imagined performing to this level, and it just felt real to me going into it. So I achieved it. So that is my 5th point. That's probably my favorite point. I could probably do a full hour podcast about that sort of self-belief. What's your best case scenario? So talking about refocusing is kind of bringing your mind in a little bit closer. So what's your best case scenario for next time? And then the last point, what can you control? So thinking back to the things that you could control. So the point previous, how did you deal with the things you couldn't change? This is on the flip side. What can you actually control? Could you control your nutrition better? Could you control the shoes that you wore? Could you control your pacing strategy? So what power target you had? Could you control, maybe the clothes that you were wearing? Could you control, breakfast, the morning of dinner, the night before? So just focusing on these different points, I think, are a kind of all-encompassing, basically large overview of how you can actually have success in terms of refocusing at any race. The second point here, the second R, is regroup. Actionable goals. Actionable is a word that gets tossed around the Stryd office because it's something that we operate very, very highly off of. But actionable goals, things that you can actually act on, and things that you can actually do, are huge. So let's say you kind of refocus and you say, what can you change? So that point of saying, what can you change? For the next time, for when it comes to creating actionable goals here in the regrouping, let's say that the things that you think you can change are running more hills. You think that you can add in core work 3 times a week, and you think that you can add in some more cross training. So, maybe you want to head to the swimming pool once a week and add that in. Create something that is actually actionable, not say, I want to swim 7 days a week and I want to swim an hour each time and I want to add that on top of my training. How about you start with something that you know you can do, add in 1 30-minute session of swimming, or say, I've seen, the Stryd podcasts and everything. I've listened to those, and I've listened to the different episodes about how you can maybe improve leg spring stiffness by adding in specific plyometrics. Or you've seen a Steve Palladino article on adding in specific plyometrics to help your leg spring stiffness. Instead of saying, I'm going to do drills every single day, and I'm going to do drills twice a day, and I'm going to be doing nothing but jump roping all day. Don't do that. Do something like, I'm going to add jump roping in twice per week, and I'm going to build up to 5 sets of 20 reps for jump roping twice per week. That is a actionable goal. So identify the things from the previous slide, from refocusing, saying, what can you change? Create an actionable goal, and then write it down in a checklist. This is literally the easiest way to accomplish it. You have a goal, put it down in a checklist and say, okay, I want to hang it on my fridge. I want to keep it as a note on my phone. I want to save it as my phone's screensaver. So I am kind of realizing that this is an actionable goal that I can actually check off. I think checklists are absolutely huge, using them in, your work-life balance, but specifically for regrouping after you refocus, checklists are huge. And then if you find that a piece of paper or interacting with the screen to kind of check stuff off doesn't keep you as motivated, the third thing and the most important thing here in terms of making sure your actionable goals happen in your regrouping stage is having friends and accountability. So people that you can be a sounding board off of, people that will rely on you for accountability. I think it's a huge thing to have other people that are sharing in your pursuit. So if you have, maybe some friends that are group runners that you train with, being able to say, hey guys, I have gone through my past buildup and I have kind of identified that, I want to add in jump roping twice per week. Will you guys help me, or will you keep me accountable? Make something fun out of it. So this is leaving a lot of the, leaving a lot of the flexibility and the options up to you. But having friends who help you with accountability is so vital, and it is so fun to create a type of environment about that you can actually have fun with, instead of seeing a goal that you set for yourself that isn't going to be actionable. It isn't going to be something that you can actually work off of. Having friends that help you with accountability is absolutely huge in the regrouping stage. So again, just restating that one more time. After you refocus, say, what can you change? Take that to the next part, say regroup. I want to create actionable goals, create a checklist, have your friends help you with said checklists and said actionable goals. So the next stage I had for here was refocusing. And so I'll be able to talk a little bit about that a little bit later. But for now, I'm going to talk about the next portion here, which is planning, executing, and reflecting. So planning for a half marathon, I'm going to talk about a specific data set from a half marathon into a marathon buildup. This athlete ran the US Olympic trials for the marathon, but also ran a half marathon 6 weeks before. So I'm going to give you a practical way to go through a planning, executing, and reflecting stage for a half marathon and a marathon, so you can kind of see a way to sort of order information and go through this. So planning for half marathon. This half marathon was in the middle of January. The goal marathon race was at the end of February. Starting to plan. So talking about planning, identifying your goal, saying, where are you at now? What can you change and what information do you have? So planning your goal, identifying, this is what I'd like to do, saying, where are you now? So let's say this athlete's critical power is 216 watts, which in this case it is. And what can you change? How can we actually improve over the course of, either the race, or how can we actually improve over the course of the training block? And then what information do you have? So in terms of Stryd, we actually have a lot of information. We can, look, if you're using Stryd, you can look at the power data that you have at different races, at different workouts, different percentages of your critical power. So using the information to help you actually on race day. So planning, what's the goal? For this athlete, it was PR, run under 78 minutes and 30 seconds for the half marathon. This athlete had a critical power of 216 watts, which is 4.85 watts per kilogram for this athlete. The ideal time for this athlete was going to be 1:16:30, so 76 minutes, 30 seconds. This would be a 2-minute PR. That'd be absolutely great. Adding a little bit more data and a little bit more information in here, the athlete at this target had a running effectiveness of 0.98, and the target power that was settled on using some of the calculators out there was 208 watts to 212 watts. So planning, we had a goal, we had information, and we wanted to understand where we were at the current moment. So again, having that critical power of 216 watts, and then using all the information that we had, coming up with a very realistic goal of 208 to 212 watts. So this is a very narrow band. And let's see how this athlete did executing on race day. So again, the target power was 208 to 212 watts. What was the result? Well, the result was actually a massive PR. 115.30, about 210 watts. So again, the target power was 208 to 212 watts. Using the information in the planning, settled on the idea, based off of the critical power with the running effectiveness at 0.98 at about this target. That was the goal in mind, to settle on 208 to 212 watts. Then executing on race day, ran right in the middle of that, literally dead smack in the middle. For a shiny new PR from about 118.30 all the way down to 115.30. So absolutely fantastic way to execute on race day. This race was the Houston Half Marathon. So it's not very hilly, but there's a decent chunk of wind about at the 9-mile section here. So a great execution on race day based off of the actual data that went into the planning. So after planning, after executing on race day, reflecting. How is being in a race environment? For this athlete, they hadn't been in a race environment in a while, so it was a good effort 6 weeks out from a goal marathon race. What can you work on? The biggest point here for this specific athlete, and the question here comes from going all the way back to the refocusing aspect from earlier in this presentation, of what can you actually work on, what can you change? And so this athlete decided to start doing a little bit more core and stability work, doing a little bit more hill work, because as you'll see, the race come race day was very hilly, and prepping for certain conditions like running in the wind. So in Boulder, we have the benefit of having a ton of wind certain times of the day. So practicing running in hills, being okay with running in the wind, and being able to dial in a power target specifically in the wind. So for this next one, it's planning for a marathon. So using that same exact flow, because we had great practice planning, executing, and reflecting. What's the goal? The goal for this marathon, because it's the US Olympic trials, is to not blow up, is to run to the athlete's ability. So the athlete still has a critical power of 216 watts, which is 4.85 watts per kilogram. The target power here was 197 to 201, 197 to 201 watts. And so this athlete had great practice executing on race day, running in this super narrow band here. And so running 208 to 212 was pretty much the maximum ability thought on race day. The athlete ran right in the middle of that 210 watts for a great about 3-minute PR. And executing on marathon race day will just ask the same exact thing. The athlete already had the planning. They just needed to do the same exact thing they did on race day. How did this marathon go for the athlete? Well, they ran 2:46.0 in the marathon. It was the athlete's second marathon. Target power of 197 to 200 watts. Actual 199 watts. So that's 2 races in a row with 2 huge performances where the athlete ran exactly, based on the planning, exactly what they were expecting to, because they executed perfectly on race day. This athlete passed 80 people in the last half marathon of the U.S. Olympic trials, pacing solely by power. So you can see how up and down the pace and the power is here. This is the U.S. Olympic trials course. So it's in Atlanta. It was super windy on race day, super hilly. So just kind of relentless up and downs, as you can see here, is a multiple loop course, but the athlete dealt with it really well, knew that probably shouldn't have too many spikes over this line here. You can see in the slide here, the spikes here, not going above critical power is the kind of vital thing to do, but the athlete ran right up on that line and managed to have a fantastic performance. Again, running right in the middle of this power target of 197 to 201 watts, based specifically on what the athlete did during training, what the athlete expected after executing during the Houston half marathon for a great performance. But the results here were absolutely fantastic, specifically in the last half. I can't stress this enough, how awesome it is. Passing 80 people in the last half, not changing anything, just running still straight at that power target. And then if you can see here right at the end, having this awesome kick at the very end, the pace and the power going well above critical power at the very end. No blow up at all, super consistent, dealing with really tough conditions. And so reflecting, again, it's the same thing. How is being in a race environment? What can you work on? Asking these same questions here that the athlete asked after the Houston half marathon, and revisiting the 3 R's earlier. Just saying, what can you work on? What can you change? And so for the next Olympic trials, this athlete is very excited and should do very, very well. I think just going forward, having this type of experience with planning, executing, and reflecting specifically on race day. So let's say we go all the way back here to the recover, the refocus, and the regroup. Talking again immediately after a marathon in this case of what can we actually do to stimulate that recovery. This athlete was very good of immediately being able to get fluids and nutrition in the next day, walk around. The next week, it's okay to take up to 2 weeks off for this athlete is what they felt comfortable with before starting to run again. But adding in things like walking, or maybe going on a hike, or doing things you wouldn't normally do to exercise that emotional component to help with recovery, to refocus, write down the goals, write down what they thought, what could they change, what couldn't they change, identifying that, and then regrouping, creating actionable goals, putting a checklist on your fridge, getting friends and accountability to help you with stuff, specifically will help with going forward and improving off of that. So this was the full presentation here. I'd be absolutely glad to take some questions and hopefully answer them. Producer Gus, if you want to send any questions that we might have, I can talk anything more about the planning, executing, reflecting for race day, as well as anything else about the Olympic trials or any other Stryd questions that you might have. I can make a special note that this was a lightweight female athlete. So the going back to the stats for the athlete, they had a critical power of 216 watts. They have a watts per kilo at critical power of 4.85 watts per kilogram. So this athlete still has quite a high watts per kilo, but this was a lightweight female athlete that ran the Olympic marathon trials as well as the Houston half marathon for a huge PR. And when we do look at performance like this, it is important to note that, hey, yeah, you say, okay, I can go out and I can do 199 watts. For me, 199 watts is, very, very, very easy. So typically my easy range for my wattage would go from 210 to 240. For this athlete, that's their marathon power because, again, their watts per kilo are up there at 4.85 watts per kilogram. So that's the thing that we should look at more for the specific type of performance. We have a question here. Hi, questions. Much is spoken about carbon shoes and marathon races, but at $200 plus, way over 200 pounds, 200 euro, and a short life, is the debate overstated? All right, so talking specifically about shoes, I'm a shoe aficionado. The people in the Stryd office sometimes have to, push aside the huge pile of shoes that I might have by my desk because I love talking about shoes. So much is spoken about them. Is the short so I'm trying to understand this question a little bit more. And a short life is a debate overstated. So maybe talking about the limited longevity of a specific type of carbon-plated shoe. I'm of the opinion that, still if a shoe feels comfortable for you and you don't feel like it's going to destroy your legs and you don't feel like, your feet are getting beat up too much, how a shoe performs in a lab test via a study and then gets named maybe isn't all it should be about in terms of performance. If you feel great in a shoe, absolutely go for that. But there is definitely that trend of brands going towards carbon-plated shoes, nylon-plated shoes, a type of plate to help with that curvature. There's plenty of studies out there. But I think, maybe the debate's a little bit overstated. I still think the athlete has to execute on race day, and shoes aren't going to run the race for you ever. I really do value having a cushion shoe in the marathon. In my first marathon, I wore a pair of shoes called the Adios Boost 3, and I loved that shoe at the time because it was the most poppy feeling. It was the most cushioned feeling shoe out there for me, and I had success doing workouts in it. But come race day, once you get to 20 miles and you still have 10K left where you're supposed to pick it up, my legs just felt shot. And so I've had success with training shoes and racing shoes that are a bit higher in stack height just because they help my legs not get as fatigued. So there's still room for plenty of debate for shoes that are, carbon plated, or shoes that have, special type of foam or makeup to them. But I still think that the athlete has to run. And it is, the athlete that achieves things on race day, not the pair of shoes, because we don't hang a medal around a pair of shoes neck. And especially if everybody is wearing all of the latest and greatest technology, then that playing field, I think, is a lot more even and reasonable. Second part of this question, in actionable marathon training, what is the number one priority for you? For me, it is getting more sleep. And I think that that's something that probably everybody could say. I'd never hear an athlete, a friend that I talk to, or somebody I interact with, say, "Oh man, I got way too much sleep last night. I'm feeling so recovered and I'm way too ready to go for this session." It's usually, "Man, I slept terribly. I was just scrolling on my phone all night. I have no idea what's wrong. I drank coffee at 8 p.m. and then I couldn't sleep." I never hear anybody say that they got too much sleep. So for me, that's the number one thing always, is more recovery. Specifically, if you're asking about the number one thing that you can possibly do that's actionable, set a specific bedtime, throw your phone to the opposite side of the room or leave it outside your room. Don't bring that media necessarily into the environment that you're sleeping in. That's the number one actionable thing. There are plenty of others that are very easy to add in, but if you're asking for the number one, adding more sleep, I think is the best. Next question here, how to keep your target power in a race? I seem to forget about target power as soon as the gun goes. I think this is a great question because the concept of pacing by power for people that are used to running by pace seems a little foreign. It seems a little hard to achieve. But the thing that I would encourage is do it in workouts. Get used to doing it, and then all of a sudden you have the trust in the system and the trust in the actual metric of power that it won't fail you on race day. the biggest thing that I think when it comes to race days, you have to have that specific preparation. When we go to expos, if I've seen you at Boston, New York, or Chicago, and you've talked to us in person, if you're using Stryd for the very first time on race day, it's probably not going to be as useful for you as if you had set a power target. You've known your auto-calculated critical power for a couple of months. You've run workouts based off that. I coach some athletes, and there is some hesitation initially with pacing stuff by power because people are so used to just using pace. But once you do see that you don't blow up, you have a workout that you can specifically improve on next time, and then come race day, you're 100% sure of yourself because you've practiced this specific power target. There's no chance for you to throw a power target out the window because it's the only thing that you feel comfortable using. So I'm a big fan of actually using it for your training specifically, then come race day, it's just another run based off power. So that's how I keep power target in a race, by actually using it during training. If we're talking about actually physically interacting with a watch that's talking to Stryd, my go-tos are either overall power, lap power, or 10-second power. So 10-second power shows you if there's a big gust of wind, or if you're running up a hill. You'll be able to adjust a little bit more in real time. I use the Stryd Zones data field right now on the Garmin 645 or the 245, or I use our Apple Watch app. I'm a huge fan of our Apple Watch app because it's so customizable. You can create a bunch of different screens for that. But physically interacting with the watch during the race, I prefer to see a overall snapshot. So let's say, again, this athlete that we were talking about earlier, they knew they wanted to stick to 197 to 201 watts for the marathon race day. They averaged 199. So if I keep an overall average in there, I can look at my overall performance and I can say, okay, if I'm 1 watt low for my overall average, I might need to pick it up a little bit more, but then I might set a 10-second or a 3-second or a lap, just to make sure those spikes kind of even out over time. So next question is, how often do you do a CP test? As an elite, I can imagine progress in CP is very small and incremental. Did you find your target power hard in the OTQ? So this is a great question, actually. So CP test, I have done it in the past. I rely on the auto critical power along with my normal training. Right now, I think that there's a totally valid approach to doing the very, very close hard workouts. But for me, I find that the auto CP is enough of a guide in my normal day-to-day training, and it reacts enough for me when I do those hard test efforts. It is very small and incremental, yes. So I had an injury last March into May. I came back to running, and within a couple of weeks, my CP was right in line with how I felt based off using the auto CP. Then once I did more races along the way, I found that it only got more and more accurate as I improved my fitness, but also I was able to prove my fitness, and auto CP showed me that. Did you find your target power hard in the OTQ? So the marathon I ran, the 218 marathon I actually, it was before I worked at Stryd, and so I didn't have Stryd. I knew what Stryd was, and I was like, oh, this would actually be really helpful, because the course I ran at has a net downhill overall, but there are bumps in the way. So it was hard to keep a very even effort because the whole race pack would surge and then they'd kind of go back and then surge again and go back. But if I had Stryd, then I would have been able to pace so much smoother than when I actually ran the OTQ. I credit a lot of my training to getting me there. I averaged like 125 miles a week for an entire year stretch. For my training block, I hit 140 miles a couple times, and I hit 150 miles in 1 week twice. So I did a ton of mileage. I did a bunch of long, hard workouts, and so that got me in shape to run. But I think I really could have run a lot faster on the day because my last 4 miles, I slowed down like 15 seconds a mile average. And so I was riding that really fine line, panicking like everybody at the end of a marathon, thinking, oh no, I hit the wall. And there's absolutely no way that I could continue. But finding, target power in a future race, I did not find it hard at all. There's a bunch of great tools out there to help you find the target power that you should do. So next question here is, thanks for the presentation, very informative. I'm thinking on switching to power, but I wanted to know how hard it is to change the mindset to this metric. Yeah, no, that's a great question. Like I was just talking about, I came from only doing pace in the past, and the transition for me was super easy. It clicked very, very quickly for me. I think the thing that you'd just need to try if you have any hesitations is just jump in for a 2-week stretch for your easy run. Maybe do an easy run completely by feel, saying, okay, I identified that this is a very easy effort. Look at the power afterwards, and then the next day, go out and try and replicate that effort by just following the power. So you'll find that following a number is very in tune with how you feel. And then maybe you want to see how power actually responds when you put more effort in. So maybe go and do 6 times 30-second hills the next day, and identify that when you run harder up a hill, the power goes up, and that'll help kind of solidify that relationship in your mind. And then maybe 2 days from then, do 6 times 30 seconds on flat and try and get close to that power number you hit on the hill, and you'll see how much faster you have to run on a flat versus going up a hill. That'll tie that relationship in with you. And then maybe, let's say the next week you do a long run, and you say, okay, I'm going to keep it easy for the first 30 minutes. So go back to that easy power target that you identified. And then when it comes to the next hour of the run, maybe say, I want to add 10% onto that, 5 to 10%, add 5 to 10% watts on top of that. That'll feel harder. And then say, okay, I want to do the next 10 minutes, 10% harder than that. And then you add that number on there. And that's a very easy way to understand the relationship of how you add power into your training. I think that, from being there and talking to a bunch of people over, the years now, because it's coming up on 2 years that I've been at Stryd, and you just have to give yourself a chance and kind of jump in. And identifying with the current climate, the current situation of, maybe some training has been disrupted, and you don't have necessarily a goal race that is on the, very easy to see horizon. Now is a perfect time. If you've ever questioned about switching your training to power, try it. Just do it. Give it, a week or two, and just see how it feels. That's the best advice I can give for how to switch your training to power. I think it's great. It keeps me very honest with myself on recovery days. So I have a specific easy target that I set. I don't go above that, because if I do, then my legs are going to feel like trash. And then on easy days, I have that target. On hard days, I have that target. I'll train at a very specific percentage of my critical power. So if I'm doing a longer sustained threshold, something, 20 to 30 minutes, 30 minutes plus, I run at a very specific percentage. So for me, that's 88 to 94%. And then if I do, threshold repeats that are 3 to 4 minutes long, I'll go, 95 to 101% of critical power, something like that. And then if I'm doing some minute on, minute off, I set a kind of baseline that I want to run 340 watts at least for my, my minute on. And then I'll set that kind of floor, and then I'll say, I don't want to go above 370 though. And so then I'll set that ceiling. So those are some concrete specific examples. If you do want to switch, the mindset is the most important thing. Yes. But now is a perfect time to do it, I think. So next question here. Hey, Evan, I did a half leading up to my marathon, which was to be on May 3rd. My race predictor was 327 watts for half, and I ran a 4-minute PR in 136.18. Congratulations. I ran a nice negative split, and I'm wondering if my CP is accurate. What is your best recommendation for getting the CP super dialed in? I have 12 months on Stryd of many different types of workouts. Like your case study, she finished strong, so she did really empty the tank. P.S. I'm aiming for a BQ in Chicago and need a sub 320, so I want to train to it. Jason. Awesome question, Jason. Hope to see you in Chicago. Fingers crossed that we will be there. So what's your best recommendation for getting the CP super dialed in? The recommendation that we found from the very beginning to the present moment is having variety for auto CP. For a race predictor in certain types of calculators, you can feed it different information. So if we go back to the athlete that I was talking about before, going off a critical power of 216 watts, just based off training, and based off of the different calculators we used. The best goal that we had was, again, that 197 to 201. And then the athlete actually did that in training. So we figured out after the half marathon that she ran on in mid-January at Houston, that running 210 watts for a half marathon should be able to run 197 to 201 watts. And then we practice that for marathon stuff. And so her coach would give her workouts, then we kind of dial in the exact power that we should be with respect to those workouts. So if the workout is like 3 times 4 miles at marathon, because we're at altitude and the race is at sea level, we're not necessarily going to just go out and try and run marathon pace on hilly terrain, on dirt roads. We're going to aim specifically for a power target. If there's wind in our face because we're running towards the mountains, we're not going to worry that all of a sudden the pace slows down because we have Stryd on the foot. We can identify that extra air resistance is adding to the power target, so we can get very specific, very exact in it. So talking about getting the CP super dialed in, I really think variety is the biggest thing. So having specific hard efforts between 1 to 3 minutes that are pretty intense, having longer duration. So we say over an hour, preferably between 90 minutes and 2 hours. It is good for some little bit higher duration. And then the thing that's probably most critical is having a hard effort between the 20 to 30 minute range. And so if your training doesn't include this, maybe do some time trials along the way of 20 to 30 minutes, see how that goes. And your auto CP should get to where you feel it is accurate. So I guess, talking about that question, that's probably my best recommendation for getting the CP super dialed in. Next question here is, hello, could you please share some tips on how to reduce ground contact time? So I believe in the Stryd Power Podcast, if you go to stryd.com/podcast and you go to, the different episodes, I think it's episode 3, Understanding Power Meter Metrics. Talk a little bit more in depth about that. But there's a great piece from Steve Palladino that I mentioned a little bit earlier, and talking about how to use specific plan metrics. And so ground contact time, it's one factor in your running and how you're able to produce, speed and performance and power, is reducing your ground contact time. That's usually, it usually goes in the same trend, in the same direction of you're running faster. It's not necessarily better to reduce your ground contact time in just your easy runs, but at specific efforts, using specific plyometrics to help your biomechanics, you can definitely find some trends along with reduced ground contact time. So this next question here is power, but is it really? The ability to produce power on different inclines varies. Yes. How can Stryd be used for race planning with inclines? Is the constant average power strategy always best? So for practical guidelines, I do believe that a constant average power is going to be the best to help you achieve the best possible performance on the day. And so, there are a bunch of different considerations to take. If you average a even power that is below a threshold that prevents you from blowing up, as we saw earlier in the data set from the Olympic Trials Marathon for the athlete we talked about, at the very end, they're able to kick it in. So they didn't exhaust themselves. They didn't have a negative performance at the end because they didn't go over that certain threshold. So talking about power with race planning on inclines, that's what this athlete did specifically. Atlanta was literally nothing but straight up and downs. So I ran the Peachtree 10K, which is a huge 10K, about 50,000 people for a 10K. It's on the 4th of July in the US, and it's in Atlanta. It's a great race. I ran that race in 2018, and I was like, wow, this race is so hilly. It is just nothing but up and down, and it felt like a lot of up. And I said, you know what, I I've run in Atlanta before. I think I know what I'm expecting. So I trained for a lot of hills before the trials, and there was nothing like Atlanta hills, the amount of rolling up and down. And so pacing just by that power average, I do still think that is the best way to have your optimal performance using the constant average power. I do acknowledge that when there are different environmental factors, like the huge wind gusts that were in Atlanta, or different things going on in different situations, that it is okay to set a range. I'm more of a fan of ranges, just for the specific cases we talked about earlier. Having a range of like 4 watts, that's because I was very familiar with the training. The athlete's very familiar with their own training as well. So being able to give yourself a range, but then be able to say, okay, we're running a marathon. We don't want to go above your critical power, because it doesn't make sense to go above your critical power during a marathon until, maybe the last 500 meters or so, the last minute, where you feel like you can kick it in. But also setting a floor. So usually if I'll give a race power target to somebody, we'll say, here's your target, what we think you can do, but here is your ceiling and here's your floor. You don't have to go below this number, because you can, pretty much no matter what, go above this floor. This ceiling, you should not go above it. You can go above it, and you for sure probably will go above it at some point, but you should not go above this ceiling if you wish to have as much success, staying between this little line here. So I hope that answered the question. If not, if anybody else does have other questions, I have 2 more here that I see in the feed. Please feel free to drop them in the chat. I find this part very, very fun, just being able to answer some questions. So second question here. Sorry, I have another question. I'm a Stryd user. I was wondering, for the easy runs, do you have a range, percentage of CP that you keep power at? Is there a thing as too slow for easy runs? That's a great question. So for me, I typically will run between 65 and 75% of my critical power for days I refer as easy runs. If I am doing a recovery run, I typically let myself go a little bit lower in that range, and that's all by feel. So I know I probably won't run below 200 watts. Again, it's that same concept of ceiling and floor. So my floor there would be about 200 watts. My ceiling would be about 250 watts, just for me. So I know that anything in there, I'm getting the job done. I'm stimulating my body. I'm getting practice of the skill of running from a mechanical standpoint. I'm circulating my blood. Depending on the duration, I might have different adaptations that are also going on. But for me, I don't think there's anything necessarily too easy for easy runs. But for me, I find that 50-watt band between 200 to 250 to be a fine area for me to feel freely to go in between. So for me, that's usually around 65 to 75% of CP. I won't usually go above 75% of CP, because that just feels a little bit too, up tempo, too purposeful. But going below, I don't think there's anything necessarily too easy. And I will also say, in my recovery from the trials, I have run a 2:18 marathon. I've run, in the 14:20s for 5K. I've run 30:09 for 10K. In my recovery for the trials, I'm doing minute on, minute off walk running. So there's no sort of ego coming back. It's all focused on just being as recovered and as easy intro back to running as possible. So I think it's too easy. Some people might say, oh, I don't feel humble enough to be able to walk, run, and alternate that. If I am running, I'm just going to go straight running. I'm not going to do anything else. Well, I think that, there's nothing too easy. So giving my, shedding a little bit of light, I'm doing minute on, minute off walk running as my comeback from the trials. So I hope that answered that question. Last one I see here in the queue is, thanks for this. I'm new to using Stryd. I hope this isn't a dumb question. No dumb questions. But how does heart rate relate to this? Yeah, that's a great question. I have a Suunto 5 and have both heart rate and power. Do I ignore the heart rate monitor? I don't think you have to ignore heart rate. I'm not a heart rate expert necessarily, so I cannot give a ton of guidance for how you should train by heart rate. But if you're using a, optical wrist-based heart rate monitor, I'd probably side more towards the side of a chest-based heart rate strap, just for reliability. Some heart rate monitors that are wrist-based and optical have some problems with cadence locking. So some people might be familiar with, in a race, it's a pretty flat little line, and then all of a sudden it goes up to something that's coincidentally right around your cadence. And that's not right. It's just locking in your cadence. But when you have a heart rate strap monitor, that might be a little bit more accurate. So looking at heart rate, I don't personally use it in my training. I used to use a heart rate strap a couple of years ago, but I would, diligently dive into the heart rate training and take my resting heart rate in the morning. I'd look at, my max heart rate that I did a test every couple of, months for, and I would run on some easy days at, what's called like a heart rate reserve. So taking your max heart rate minus your resting heart rate in the morning, and then having a certain range to play in. I found it very complicated and very confusing. I read about it and I heard a couple people using that type of strategy, but I just found it not fun. Like it was not fun for me to train. And when I was training and racing at that time, I didn't want to not have fun. I wanted to enjoy what I was doing, not, constantly stare at my watch and say, oh no, I'm like one beat over. I have to like basically slow down to almost a walk now to get it averaged back down. So for heart rate stuff, again, I'm not necessarily a expert on that, but in my personal case, I found it not as fun to use. For Stryd and power, I have a little bit more of a range, and I can feel that range a little bit more. But if you have a heart rate monitor and it's something that you want to look at, don't feel the pressure or the need to throw it out there. So thanks, Arlene, for that question. What do you look at during the race? So instant power, lap power, average power. My normal setup, if I'm doing a race, I'm either using a Garmin 645 or a 245, and I'll use the Stryd zones data field. I will have my 10-second power on the top, and I'll have my lap power on the bottom. That is what I typically do. I can also set, another screen if I'm curious about the distance or the overall timer. I'll also put Stryd zones on there, so my lap power will show up on a screen along with a timer. So I'm very simple when it comes to my setup. I find that really preferential. If I'm running a workout, typically I like to run, with the Apple Watch, the Stryd Apple Watch. I find that a great experience. If you go to the Stryd Apple Watch app and you look at the workouts that are there for you to select from, if you don't have any of your own customized workouts, there's one called Evan's Workout. So I like that little Easter egg, almost like an Easter egg thrown in there. But I usually use the Apple Watch app if I want to have a little bit more data to see. So maybe I'm working on, keeping my cadence up, so I can have the Apple Watch app show me my, lap power and 10-second power and average cadence for that lap, as well as my pace and my distance and my heart rate and my ground contact time on one screen. Then I go to 2 more screens and I have 7 metrics on each screen as well if I want to do that. But usually I keep it pretty simple. So that's what I typically look at during the race. Another question here. In all my marathons, I have bonked in the last 6 miles with dropping cadence and power and pace. How do you personally approach this part of the race? I approach it with, kind of like scars in my mind from some of the past races, but also some, success in my past races. So the first marathon I ran, like I mentioned, my last 8 miles, I bonked super hard. My best marathon ever. I still slowed down quite a bit in the end. And then this past marathon that I did, I didn't run the last 5 miles because my legs were too messed up to run. And so I'm sure there are better people to ask for this. But the one thing I'd say is maybe some strategies to get over this type of wall or the bonk is identify in training, is your power target realistic? So if your power target isn't necessarily realistic and you haven't trained to that, then maybe you should lower your power target, or maybe you should practice. If you're doing something like a 2 to 2.5 hour long run, maybe the last 30 to 45 minutes, you should run at a closer percentage to actual race power to start practicing that specific introduction of that race power to a specific scenario in your training. So while you're already fatigued, how do you actually practice running at your race power? For dropping cadence and power and pace, it just sounds to me like the last 6 miles. Maybe your body wasn't prepared to necessarily go to that place for sustaining that power. Nutrition might also be something. So talking a little bit more about the trials, the Atlanta Track Club put on the U.S. Olympic trials, and they did a fantastic job. Every couple of miles, you had your own personal fluid bottle. And so fueling is a huge important thing too. So if you don't usually practice fueling during your workouts, that might be something that you can add in your workouts to feel more comfortable come race day, specifically fueling to help your body handle that type of intensity and that type of load on race day. So for me, I like to fuel, like the most minimally I will fuel is a couple of drinks of, I use a type of fluid called Maurten, Maurten, and it's a powder that mixes into water and it forms what's called a hydrogel. And so it typically has a little bit more calories that you can get in because it splits the type of fuel sources that it gives you. So it actually turns into a gel in the stomach, and it helps you just have a little bit more sustained nutrition over time. So I like that, but practicing fueling in training and practicing fueling in racing is also an important part to prevent a bonk. You actually have to teach your body, hey, and teach your body is a very open term, but you have to practice that actual type of fueling during training to have success on race day as well. So cool. I think that's all the time that I've allotted. I really appreciate everybody for tuning in. If you have any questions, you can totally always email us at support@stryd.com. You can also find this as a audio clip on our podcast that I have a ton of fun doing. The podcast is great. If you haven't subscribed already, please go to stryd.com/podcast. You can find a link to any of the podcasts that you probably listen to, or any of the podcast streaming services that you listen to there, or you can just go to your favorite podcast app and type in Stryd, Stryd, and it should show up right there. Press subscribe, turn on notifications, whatever you want to do, and then download all the past episodes and listen to them, because there's a ton of great interviews, a ton of great training discussion there. Please feel free to follow us on social media at Stryd Running. We're always trying to put out more community involvement posts, whether we're on Twitter or Instagram. The Facebook community is great. So you can go to facebook.com/Stryd community. It's a great group there, but I'm so excited to wrap up this webinar. This was For the Love of Running Part 3. Again, my name is Evan. We'll be back next week with a couple more episodes. If you want to find out how to be notified about these, please go to our website and sign up for the newsletter, and we'll be able to send out some more information there. Or you can always go to our social media. We'll put some links there as well. So thanks, everybody, for tuning in. I really do appreciate it. We'll be back next week. Hope everybody is staying safe and healthy. If you have any things you're curious about hearing from for one of these future webinars, please feel free to send it our way as well. We will try to include that in the future. For now, this was webinar 3. Have a great rest of your Friday, everyone. Bye-bye.